most vaccines for pathogens were developed over numerous years of research and then clinical trial, and then finally, manufacturing and deployment for use. One of the advantages we have today is, we have technologies that we did not have access to years ago. So for example, in late December, early January, as soon as the virus was sequenced and that was made public, that was published, that was made available across the globe, scientists could begin immediately in starting to look to develop a vaccine based on what the sequence of this virus was and what would be needed. We've made tremendous progress in a short period of time. It's probably unprecedented, at least in my lifetime, that I don't recall any vaccine being put through the early development and deployment into phase 1, 2, and 3 in this short of a time frame. And the only way that vaccine doses would be available from these vaccines that are in clinical trials at this point early on is that the governments around the world have decided to go ahead and manufacture doses of these vaccines at risk. So what traditionally would happen is you would go through all your studies, you determine whether or not it was safe and an effective vaccine, and you would be seeking your regulatory agency approval for use of that, and then the manufacturers would start scaling up and batching up that material. Given that you're in a pandemic and you're really fighting in a war-like environment, the vaccine manufacturers have, with a lot of funding from government entities, is they've decided to go ahead and manufacture doses so that the hope is that a vaccine will be shown to be safe and effective, and that those materials will be manufactured and be ready for deployment. We won't have enough for 7 billion people immediately available, but there will be vaccines that will have been made and ready to be deployed to start to get some of the most vulnerable people coverage early on.
Thank you. We're going to circle back and with a few more questions, a little more detailed questions about that area. But Osondu, just to start you out, is it possible for a COVID-19 vaccine to be distributed in a timely and equitable way across high and low income countries? If you can talk a little bit about allocation versus capacity.
Sure, thanks, Mary. It's a pleasure to be on this panel and also to be alongside with Lavanya and Thomas. So thank you very much. To your question about the possibility of the vaccines being allocated and distributed, it is possible. Yes, it is possible, but is it likely? The probable answer will be no. And that's because for you to understand this, you need to think about all the interests that are at play. So for allocation issues, the biggest question right now on the table is who gets any vaccine that is developed. Should it go to the people, to the countries that can pay the most, or should it go to the places where the pandemic is hitting the most? And those questions are still unresolved, even as we speed through the process of developing the first vaccine. And so right now you have different countries around the world signing contracts with different vaccine manufacturers to make sure that any successful vaccine gets to their populations. And so what we're seeing now is that high-income countries that can afford a lot of money are able to sign contracts with vaccine manufacturers, while lower-income countries and some lower middle-income countries do not have that. Without those resources, are not able to secure those vaccines. Is that the best way we can allocate these vaccines? Probably not. Organizations like Gavi have instituted some mechanisms like the COVAX Advanced Market Commitment to try to look for more equitable ways to allocate the vaccines. Discussions are still ongoing, but if anything, we're also seeing around the world is that these bilateral contracts with countries and vaccine manufacturers still continue. there is still hope that something good will come out of this, and I think there's a lot of promise, but it remains to be seen how that will play out. But thinking about distribution, so having the vaccine, getting an allocation or being able to buy the vaccines is one step. But being able to distribute the vaccines within the country and ensuring that it gets to everyone who needs it in a timely fashion is a separate question. And when you think about the different countries around the world, some of these countries, the last time they embarked on a rapid, large-scale vaccine distribution campaign was either during the smallpox campaign or during the polio eradication campaign. Many have not done widespread vaccine delivery. And in most countries around the world, vaccine delivery is usually restricted to targeted populations, most times children under 5, elderly populations. And so the infrastructure to deliver a vaccine that will be required by pretty much the entire population is not there. And so for countries right now to quickly ramp up that capacity to deliver will depend on first what they have decided to do. In some countries, there are talks about using existing infrastructure, routine immunization systems. Some plan to supplement with the supplementary immunization activities, the special immunization days. Some are planning to use private contractors, some are planning to use their military. But there are very big logistic challenges that countries will face. So to build them and deliver them to the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Osondu. I also want to circle back to you about the details of distribution in different countries. And you had mentioned something earlier called cold chain. And so I'll come back to that and ask you to explain that a little bit more in detail. Sure. Lavanya, a question for you. If you could help us understand what vaccine hesitancy means, we see that term thrown around a lot in the press, and how does vaccine confidence look different in different countries?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mary. And like you mentioned, a lot of people are talking about vaccine hesitancy these days. So vaccine hesitancy is defined as the decision of individuals to delay or refuse vaccines. And there have been several global surveys looking at reasons for vaccine hesitancy, so reasons why people refuse or delay vaccines. And the top reason is concerns related to vaccine safety and efficacy. There are also considerations related to cultural, religious beliefs, sometimes political beliefs, depending on the context. And then finally, you have vaccine knowledge and awareness that drives vaccine hesitancy. And so the difference that we see in different countries is how these three factors play out. So in countries like the US and countries in Europe, you'll see more concerns related to vaccine safety and efficacy. People are talking more in terms of risk-benefit trade-offs. Whereas in some of the low and middle income country contexts that we work in, especially rural remote settings, we often see concerns that are driven by low vaccine knowledge and awareness. So even though at the top of it, the concerns are pretty similar, I think the drivers of those concerns vary by context. I do want to mention that, in the field that I work in, the success of any vaccine is not defined by the clinical trial data or whether a vaccine is successful in regulatory approval, but rather defined by the number of people who accept it. So a vaccine that's well accepted is a successful vaccine. And vaccine success is really determined by the concerns that people have about the vaccine. So a vaccine can be undermined by vaccine hesitancy. And that's really what we are seeing in the context of COVID.
Thank you. I'm just going to jump back to Tom for a minute. We talk a lot about waiting for approval and clinical trials and regulatory processes, at least right now, while a vaccine is being developed. How are vaccines approved for use in other countries, and specifically low-income countries? How is it different from the US and high-income countries?
Well, there's, you know, the FDA for the US helps to set a global standard, but within the European, you have the countries, you have the European Medicines Agency, and a lot of countries throughout Africa are attempting to harmonize and develop standards that are sort of in parallel with the EMA. And then, you know, if you look towards Japan, Japan has another regulatory approach, and that's the Pharmaceutical and Medical Device Agency. And there are some things that are consistent across the board, but there are some areas within the domain of manufacturing that comes with a little bit more regulatory oversight between the different agencies. So for example, both the European and the Japanese regulatory agencies put a heavy weight into having documentation of all the raw materials that are part of the manufacturing process. In other words, a lot of documentation assuring that they meet the specifications of what they should be. The FDA requires a bit less of that. The European agency requires for manufacturing that a facility have what is called a QP person on site or as part of the manufacturing. This is someone that meets a certain level of training and expertise and approval by their agency, who has quality control, if you will, or quality assessment over the manufacturing process. So they are monitoring documents, monitoring what we call batch records. So when you manufacture material, you have all sorts of documentation and recordings of parameters that you're measuring as part of that this person has oversight over that process. If you manufacture something that does not have that oversight, it is typically very hard then to get that material approved to do a trial within a European governed country. So each one has a little bit different, like I said, oversight to the manufacturing process. I think across the board, most all have the same concept when it comes to the clinical trials. You know, you have an initial, or what we refer to as the IND, or the approval to begin a clinical trial. And then you have the sort of the early phase 1 safety, and what we call safety and early immunogenicity phase 2, and then moving on to phase 3, which are the larger efficacy and then final safety checks before one would go to get a licensure approval.
Thanks, Tom. I just wanted to remind our attendees that we welcome your questions in the Q&A. Osondu, I wanted to go back to, you know, once a vaccine is approved, the dissemination of the vaccine, and you were talking a little bit about cold chain issues and, you know, making sure that vaccine gets to its destination safely. Can you go into that in a little bit of detail?
Sure, thanks, Mary. So the cold chain in general refers to the system that ensures that a vaccine that is produced is kept at the right temperature all the way from the manufacturers, all the way till it gets, from where it was produced all the way till it gets to the patient. And for the COVID-19 vaccine, if it turns out that the vaccine that is produced requires a cold chain, which most likely will be the case, then any country that intends to make this vaccine available for its citizens will have to ensure that its cold chain is working. And this will be over and above what is currently needed at the moment. So most countries have a cold chain in place to take care of their routine immunization systems. And we know that there are variations in how successful the routine immunization programs have been around the world. So for example, coverage with DTP3 vaccines, which is one of the indices for monitoring vaccine coverage around the world, it it's about 85% right now. But 85% for the world masks a lot of variations. So there are several countries that have DTP3 coverages that are less than 50%. You have countries like Papua New Guinea, Kiribati, Somalia, Sudan, and all. So these are South Sudan, I mean, and these are countries where the capacity to deliver existing vaccines are very weak, and it will be difficult, a very big challenge for them to also take on the additional responsibility to deliver any COVID-19 vaccine. That doesn't mean that other countries that have good vaccine coverage, DTP3 coverage at this point, will be successful. It only means that they have demonstrated a history of being able to do this, and so it might not be as difficult a task in making them achieve this. So the cold chain is really important, ensuring that you have appropriate storage and at the right temperature. You have special delivery vehicles, you have special temperature controlled boxes or systems in the health facilities so that the vaccines are kept at the right temperature all the way till they are received by the patient. And so this is really critical, and countries that intend to get vaccines to their population will need to ensure that this system works.
Thank you. Tom, can you weigh in for a second and tell us, just give us a little background on why a vaccine may or may not need to be chilled? Oops, you're on mute.
Could you rephrase why it may not?
Yeah, why do some vaccines need to be kept chilled?
Well, yeah. So different vaccines are manufactured with different, concepts or approaches to how they're going to work. And depending on that, sometimes you can't, if you can lyophilize something, that is dry it down, freeze dry it, then many times you can keep a vaccine material at room temperature, or a little bit of refrigeration, not a freezer, if you will, type of cold chain. If it's some of the more innovative approaches at vaccines that we call lipid nanoparticles, or different types of particles, if you will, they have to be kept there. You can't lyophilize them, because if you lyophilize them, dry them down, you'll change the properties of them. So they have to be kept more, if you will, in solution, and that solution has to be kept chilled, otherwise it will denature. So most likely these early vaccines, as was stated earlier, are going to require cold chain. At least one, I believe, will require freezer temperatures for dissemination. So that is going to make it a bit more challenging.
Thank you. Let's jump to Lavanya. I wanted to talk a little bit about herd immunity. What is herd immunity? Do people in the US and elsewhere really understand what that means and how it's achieved?
Yeah, herd immunity is a very misunderstood concept. So herd immunity occurs when a large proportion of the population is immune to a disease. And that means that the disease cannot propagate from one person to another in a community setting. So the transmission is low because of herd immunity. So you can achieve herd immunity in two ways. One is by getting the disease. So your body gets the disease, develops some immunity to it. And if many people get the disease, then you build up herd immunity over time. And then the other way to build up herd immunity is by getting a vaccine, right? So out of the two options, getting the disease and trying to build up herd immunity that way is a riskier option, because you're risking serious consequences of the disease. So take, for example, COVID, right? It's a contagious disease, and it's almost like rolling the dice. So you could be asymptomatic, have no symptoms, but you could also have symptoms that are so severe that you end up in the hospital. So you really don't know what's going to happen if you get COVID-19. On the other hand, with vaccines, the ingredients in vaccines, or the germs in the vaccines, are either inactivated, they're weakened, or we use components of the germs, so that your body is still able to recognize a foreign object and build immunity, but it comes without the severe consequences that you can get with the disease. A lot of the times, I don't like to use herd immunity as the reason why people should get vaccinated, because in many cases, people who don't get vaccinated cluster. So when we say, oh, the herd immunity is 70% or 80%, there may still be communities where the vaccination rates is so low that they don't have herd immunity. And when you think about this on an individual level, right, there may be 70% herd immunity in your community, but if you as an individual are not vaccinated and you come in contact with a person who has infection, that community herd immunity is not going to protect you in any way because you don't have immunity, right? And so herd immunity is a very misunderstood concept, and it's not something that people should use as an excuse to refuse or delay vaccines.
Thanks for that. And I have a question that you or Tom might be able to answer related to that. So, and we also had a question from the audience on nationalism. So we are hearing that the US and the UK are buying up lots of vaccine. And so if everybody in our countries gets vaccinated and we have so-called herd immunity, but then we travel to countries that don't, how does that work? What happens to that concept of herd immunity then?
Yeah, I can take the initial stab at it. And the answer is the same. If you are not vaccinated, first of all, it doesn't matter where you are. There may be high herd immunity in the country that you're visiting, in the community that you're visiting. But if you come in contact with an infectious person, your risk of infection is high. The other sort of argument is that we often see imported cases of disease. So even, there may be diseases that are eliminated in the US. With travel and with the connections that we have globally, we often get imported cases of diseases. And again, when that comes into a community where people are under vaccinated, we see these outbreaks. So I think just relying on building herd immunity in one setting is not enough in this day and age. We should really be focusing on global herd immunity, making sure the vaccine is equitably available across the globe, because this is a pandemic and we have to curb it in every part of the globe.
The other part I'd add to that is that we really don't know yet what the overall effectiveness is and protection of these vaccines will be. So, for example, measles vaccine is probably one of the best known that is, very high effective rate. I think it's probably high 90s if I remember correctly. Smallpox vaccine was very high effective rate in protection. Flu vaccine, we can look at numbers, and that's variable from year to year. It can be down in the low numbers of 30, 40%, and it can be higher in 60% protection or 70%. So if we end up with a COVID vaccine in some of these initial first waves that only give us 70% protection, let's say, or 60% protection. If we then travel, then even though we've been vaccinated, but if we travel to endemic areas yet, you're still running the risk of getting infected because of that discrepancy in terms of 100% protection versus what you would hope a vaccine would give you, or a higher number at least. So I think we have to look at this globally.
Yeah. And Osondu, you had some statistics, I think, on US and UK.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the very nature of infectious diseases makes it such that until everyone is safe, no one is safe. Right? We live in a world where there's global travel and there's a lot of interactions, but we also live in a world where politicians have to respond to their domestic interests, and especially in election years. So even though, like the question in the chat box says, there's an expectation that richer countries will help out the poorer countries. Richer countries, first of all, respond to internal pressures before they respond to external pressures. What we're hoping is that this doesn't negate or put in jeopardy the global picture. So right now, we know the US has gone into several contracts with several companies. Very conservative estimates has secured close to 400, 500 million doses. Estimates suggest that the UK has enough to take care of, to vaccinate its population 3 times over. And these are all contracts to ensure that whichever company comes out with the first success, that the high-income countries get this. Will the UK use all the doses it's purchased? Most likely not. But this is a way to hedge against not getting the vaccine that comes out at the very first. So what we're hoping is that through other facilities like the COVAX, AMC being run by Gavi, and by other maybe bilateral engagements, like China has gone into some bilateral engagements with several countries, that other low-income countries that do not have access or do not have the resources to play in this high-stakes market will be able to get some vaccines.
Thanks, Osondu. Can you explain to anybody who might not know, what is COVAX and what's Gavi and Gavi's role?
So COVAX AMC is a short form for coronavirus vaccine advanced market commitment. And so Gavi is a global nonprofit that seeks to improve access and coverage of vaccines around the world. It focuses mostly on low and middle income countries, and it has some focus countries. What Gavi does is to ensure that childhood immunization is front and center in many countries. It provides funding support, sometimes provide technical support. In this case, the COVAX AMC is being led by Gavi as a means to ensure that vaccines get to these low and middle income countries that it has focused on for the past several years. And the idea will be to ensure that any country that buys into COVAX will be able to guarantee or get 25% vaccines. Any successful vaccine that is in the COVAX pool will be able to get 25% doses to cover 25% of its population. And then the rest will be distributed around the world based on need and based on the current nature of the pandemic. And so this is ongoing right now. Countries are being asked to buy into them. Most of the lower middle income countries have subscribed to COVAX. The high income countries, which will be providing the funding and most of the resources, not all of them have bought into COVAX. So it's still an ongoing game, and we'll see what happens.
Osondu, what's your thoughts on the fact that, 20 years ago, we went through 25 years ago, scale up to provide antiretrovirals throughout the world, when many places in resource-challenged areas did not have access to these drugs to treat those with HIV. And, we developed global access, and we developed a number of approaches to help get more affordable medicines to the people that needed it. And I'm cautiously optimistic that some of the experiences we've had through that scale up and the years of working with that's going to help us when we go to global distribution and access with this vaccine.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm also cautiously optimistic. I think if you look back at the HIV/AIDS experience, that at the center of that experience, and also right now, the main issues are really around profit potential from the company's perspective, and also access from the country's perspective. So you have companies that are trying to maximize their profits, either through differential pricing around the world or restricting to certain markets. And you have, on the other hand, you have countries that are trying to ensure guaranteed access to vaccines or medicines to their population. Now, how these two interests interact is anybody's guess, but in the end, people who have resources or countries who have resources tend to get more. Now, for the HIV situation, there was a lot of activism around making these drugs cheap. Even when some of the drugs were cheap, were made, the generics were made cheap in India and in Brazil, there were a lot of fights and litigations that went all the way to the World Trade Organization, and they had to activate the TRIPS. And these issues led to some agreements with different countries. And so in the end, the good thing is that a lot of sub-Saharan African countries that could not afford the brand name antiretrovirals were able to afford the generics, and that expanded coverage of ARTs around the world. Will this happen for COVID-19 vaccine? I don't know. We're also talking about different pricing structures. So for annual HIV/AIDS was the lifetime treatment, and annual treatment was about $1,000 for the generics. But estimates for the COVID-19 vaccine may just be $10 a pop or $20 a pop, depending on how many or who comes first. So we're hoping that we learn lessons from there. We are hoping that the lessons that we've learned from there will be useful for this situation. But right now, I think the bare knuckles fight going on right now is to respond to domestic pressures, especially when there's an election coming up. So yeah.
Thanks, Osondu. Just listening to you talk sort of historically about other vaccine and dissemination of medication for HIV/AIDS makes me, this may be a question actually more for Lavanya, how does a community's experience with past outbreaks affect their views now on outbreaks and vaccination?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mary. So in many of the low and middle income settings that we work with, people are still familiar with vaccine preventable diseases much more than parents maybe here in the US. And we find that they are more willing to accept vaccines because they tend to see cases sometimes in their communities, or the stories are more recent. When there is a vaccine that's available, we actually see increased acceptance in the context of an outbreak. But I would say the current context of COVID is a little bit different. We have this urgent need. There is a pandemic going on, but there's also a new vaccine that's in progress. And I think that's where we run into an issue. So going back, if there is a vaccine that already exists, I think there is more willingness to accept the vaccine, especially among parents and situations with younger kids. For example, in the most recent measles outbreak that we saw, parents in New York, for example, were seeking out vaccination. So it's a combination of that increased demand, but also increased supply. Public health agencies then invest more in getting the vaccines out there. There are mass vaccination campaigns. So there is a response to the outbreak. I think we are in a unique situation, or maybe not so unique situation here, where there is this large pandemic, but there is no vaccine yet.
Thank you. Osondu, that actually makes me think about something you've said about dissemination to communities. In the US, we go to our doctor's office or CVS and we get our flu shots. How does it work in low-income countries?
So most low and middle income countries also have health systems that require them to either go to the health center or a health post or a dispensary to get childhood on-5 vaccinations. But also they do, in some countries where either populations are dispersed or it is really hard to get to the last mile of patients that might require vaccines, they do national campaigns, supplementary immunization activities, as they are called in some countries. And this is usually 1 or 2 days in the year where health workers are mobilized en masse to provide vaccines to all the children who need them. This is done a lot for measles vaccination. It was done a lot for the last legs for the polio eradication campaigns in many countries. And so these are the two main ways that many low and middle income countries get vaccines. There is talk about some countries trying to build parallel emergency systems that might roll this out, because in this case, it will not just be for children, it will be for the elderly, it will be for the working population, it will be for essential health workers. And so they're thinking about alternative measures to roll this out through the country. And this might require using national resources like the military, or in places where there are national groups like women's groups or lady health workers or things like that, that they're building to, they will build on that to make vaccines available.
Thank you. That brings up the question of, traditionally it seems like a lot of vaccines are given to children. Tom, this question is for you. How will COVID-19 vaccination look for children and young adults? We know it's hitting our older populations harder and people with compromised health. Like, will children age into vaccines, or, do we know how this is gonna look yet?
Yeah, I think we will eventually get to a point where, yes, where this pathogen is not going away. It's here. And I think we will grow into an approach to this, that this just becomes another vaccine that at an appropriate age, children get coverage for, as well adults need to get. We don't know yet how effective the vaccine is going to be for durability. Is it going to last like a flu vaccine, one you need it every year? Or will you be able to get this vaccine and will it be protective for 5 years, 10 years? So until we learn that, I think there's a lot of variables here. But I think eventually everyone, and children at a certain age, will need to be protected. And then the question is whether or not that one-time protection is enough, or whether you'll have to come back and do boosters, or will we have to adapt the vaccine periodically, like we do with the flu vaccine? I think we're right now we're pretty comfortable in that we're not seeing a lot of mutations, such as you see with some viruses, that would indicate that maybe every year you'd have to make a new vaccine. So we're hopeful that we'll be able to get a vaccine product that gives you some sustained period of protection. But there are a lot of unknowns of this whole area.
Yeah, and thank you. And one of those unknowns is safety. Everybody's talking about safety, and I guess this is kind of a question for you, but Lavanya might want to weigh in. How will we know when an approved vaccine is safe? And then Lavanya, how much is being done to communicate the safety process to people?
Yeah, with vaccines, what everyone needs to always keep in mind is that there's a higher bar for safety with vaccines that typically than there is with drugs. With medication, if I have hypertension or I have a problem, then I need to take that medication. So there's a little bit different, risk benefit there. With vaccines, you're typically giving them to healthy people that are, walk in and to receive that vaccine shot. And if for some reason they have an adverse event, it can be devastating. So the bar is higher there. I think what, hopefully we're going to learn, and there'll be full transparency coming out of these large efficacy trials. If we don't see many adverse events, that's going to be a positive signal to people that the vaccine is safe. If we start to be able to get data from those who have participated in the trial to understand what type of immune response that they've made. We do know that some vaccines can induce antibodies that are not the favorable antibodies. We call them enhancing antibodies, and they can actually make someone be more receptive to getting infected. And that's something that you would not want with a vaccine aimed at a pathogen that has such widespread numbers as we see with COVID. So, we're going to know it's safe when we have full transparency and full vetting of the data that comes out of these large efficacy trials. We understand that people have not had many adverse events, or if they did have some adverse events, they're minimal and mild, and nothing that is long lasting. And then when we are able to understand the types of immune profiles that people make and understand how durable and robust they are, that's going to be the other part of this equation of understanding safety.
Yeah, and just to respond to your question about what we are doing to communicate the safety of the vaccine, I think my answer to that is we don't really know which vaccine is going to be approved, so it's a little premature to think about communication materials about specific vaccines. I think the focus right now is really on the process. So what's going on in the clinical trials, what is the regulatory process going to look like? And I've said this before, that what people are looking for is transparency and reassurance that the process will be driven by science. So that's really where the communication is focused. So FDA, for example, released some more information about the stringency of their procedures. So there's a lot of information about the process itself. But really, I think on a public health level, there isn't a lot of communication about specific candidates because, again, we don't know which one will be approved.
So do you think that, the public's concern about safety right now is valid?
I don't know whether I would phrase the question that way. I think, we are in a unique situation in terms of what we are facing. The consequences of COVID-19 have just been so devastating. I think all of us are affected on different levels. There's not just the health impact, we have economic impacts. Many of us are still under lockdown. And it's just this perception of threat. I think the perception of threat is really heightened. And we are contending with the development of a new vaccine. Usually people don't pay attention to vaccine development processes. They don't pay attention to clinical trials until there is a vaccine that's on the market. But I think this is such a unique situation. There is so much scrutiny of the vaccine development process that people have questions about it because they may not have necessarily followed vaccine development earlier. So I think people are justified in asking questions. And really what we are doing in terms of communication is communicating about the process. That's what the public health agencies are focused on. Again, we don't have information about specific candidates to provide that reassurance. I think the companies that are publishing that information are probably doing a good thing in terms of reassuring the public, but I think we still need more data. We need more information.
Thank you. Tom, I wanted to ask you about DGHI and the work you're doing on developing a vaccine that would be effective on other coronaviruses. Do you have any information or updates on that?
Well, just that the teams here, mainly the team led by Bart Haynes here, and is working very hard to try to develop what we would call a pan-coronavirus vaccine. That would be a vaccine that would cover a number of different coronaviruses and provide a more global protection. We also have an effort underway led by Greg Simpowski here that is been funded through DARPA. We're in the process of manufacturing it here in our phase 1 facility, what we call an mRNA that will be engineered to develop a signal, if you will, a programming signal to people that if they receive that, then their cells will start making an antibody that will provide, we think of that as a passive protection. It's not a permanent protection like you think of when you give a traditional vaccine that was alluded to earlier as a protein or an attenuated substance. So there are a couple different paths that we're pursuing. We hope to have some in clinical trials in early 21. We won't be, you know, we're not on the first wave of these large trials that are underway, but we believe there is opportunity for us to come with innovative developments that will offer benefits for the future.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask the audience if you have any more questions. We're kind of closing in on the end of the event today, and we want to make sure you get your questions in if you have any.
I have a question for Tom and Lavanya. So Tom, so I think the amount of resources that have been made available for COVID-19 has pretty much told us what is possible when money is not an issue. But it's also shown us that there are some things that we need to be careful about. And that's one of them is about how to conduct science in the full glare of the public. So I was just wondering whether there are some lessons that you think are applicable that we could learn from this for the next infectious disease outbreak, which may or may not be a pandemic, but we see it's probably going to happen in the future. Are there lessons that we could learn? And for Lavanya, how does this affect the confidence of the public who are interested, may not have all that the training to understand the nitty-gritty of science, but are willing and ready to learn? And how do we do this?
So for us at the Vaccine Institute, you know, we've had a long-standing presence in infectious disease and working on vaccines for a number of different entities, and you know, most notably our work at HIV prevention vaccine. And we've had a long-standing approach at transparency. You know, our teams are constantly vetting information with each other, being open with the discovery process. And then probably about 7, 8, 9 years ago, we started developing additional resources within the Institute. So we became much more translational. Prior to that, we were much more in the discovery phase and not translational. So today, we are very integrated across, you know, discovery to translation. We have our own GMP suite, so we can begin early on in a project and develop a conceptual approach for a vaccine, or I like to say sometimes a countermeasure, because sometimes they're not always vaccines. They may be some other type of monoclonal antibody or something else that we can go from a discovery phase and then quickly into manufacturing. And then with someone like Chip Walter's team with us, who runs our clinical trials effort, we can get these products into clinical trials early. Now, all that is predicated on having a lot of money to support that. And we were fortunate here at the Institute that we had a lot of investment over a 20-year period in HIV that provided technology and highly talented people as part of our collaborative environment here. When COVID hit, we were almost able to flip a switch and turn that, if you will, that enterprise from HIV to mobilize it to work on issues related to COVID. And we've done that in a number of different areas. I think that was the key. If we did not have that infrastructure in place, there is no way we could have been a significant player in offering either, whether it be, you know, countermeasures or testing or anything else we've done from the Institute today. But it does require a sizable investment of money. Long-term going forward, I would hope there would be, I've advocated for years that there'd be something like a block grant type of funding to groups that have talents and expertise to respond quickly. I mean, we had to write grants in the spring to get money. We were able to start some things, but we had to rapidly write grants. If there was pre-approved approaches to get money rolling to centers such as the Vaccine Institute here or the Global Health Institute or other entities across the globe, that they could rapidly get involved in this, I think you would save a lot of time in the future when we have to respond. And there will be another. I mean, history has shown us there's been these types of assaults that we have to respond to, and history will prove itself again. We just don't know whether it will be next year, 20 years from now, or 50 years from now. But there are a lot of lessons to learn, I believe, from this one.
Yeah, and I think from my side, the answer is somewhat similar in that we need more investments in studying or understanding vaccine hesitancy and trying to identify interventions that could help address vaccine hesitancy. So the study of vaccine hesitancy has been traditionally underfunded. And it's, even though we've seen dropping confidence in vaccines in the last 10 years, for example, we haven't seen the rise in research funding, for example. And so we are in a situation right now where we are really playing catch up, right? It's not just the COVID-19 pandemic, it's the pandemic of vaccine hesitancy, pandemic of misinformation. So we are fighting this battle on many different fronts. And what I take away from this is, we really need more investments in trying to understand how we can really build vaccine confidence, how we can reduce hesitancy. And that really needs to be a consistent process, not just something we do when we are confronted with an outbreak.
Thanks, Lavanya and Tom. We have a question related. We have two questions, but I'm going to give the second one that came in to you first because it's on vaccine hesitancy. The question is, what are some of the ways we can help address the issue of vaccine hesitancy, which may arise from safety concerns and the growing mistrust of what others may describe as Western medicine? And this is someone speaking as an international student from the Gambia in West Africa. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, again, I think addressing vaccine hesitancy is not something that can happen overnight. Because a lot of it involves building trusted relationships, credibility of information, and things like that, which require time. The most effective intervention that we have, or the intervention with the most evidence base, is provider recommendation, right? So most people who answer surveys on vaccine hesitancy say that they trust their providers. But we really don't incentivize our providers to have those kinds of conversations. Our clinic visits are so short. There isn't enough time to have those kinds of conversations. So I think there's a lot that needs to change in terms of the policy level, how our healthcare appointments are structured, how we think about vaccine hesitancy, again, not just as something we can do when there is an outbreak, because that's just like putting a Band-Aid on a wound, right? So you need to address vaccine hesitancy on a more consistent basis so that when there is an outbreak, you have trusted relationships with people, people believe what you say, and are actually willing to accept vaccines.
Thank you. And then there's this additional question for Tom, I think, from Mohammed. Thank you for your question, Mohammed. With fast track designations and accelerated clinical trials, how can you monitor long-term adverse events of a vaccine?
So I think you're speaking to the EUA approval, the fast track approval. So one thing to note, that EUA approval of a vaccine, should that be granted, that's not a permanent approval. That's an emergency use authorization, and the vaccine manufacturers will have to come back and seek a permanent licensure approval at a later or subsequent time. And what will happen, and it happens all the time when vaccines or drugs are approved, is they go into what's called a post-marketing approval period of monitoring. So once a product is out there, you still have a responsibility for filing with the FDA and with the manufacturer adverse events as they become known. And over time, one would see that if a certain type of vaccine that had received some sort of approval process you were seeing more adverse events, long term, let's say a year later versus what may have been seen during the phase 3 efficacy trials. So there are processes in place to provide for long-term monitoring to assure that we're not missing anything that comes after the initial approvals. And I think there's been examples in history where things have been approved initially, and then subsequent there have been adverse events that have been gathered and learned about, and then approval has been taken back or modified based on learning more about that after it's been more of a widespread distribution of that product.
Thanks, Tom. We are wrapping up the last couple of minutes, and I just wanted to throw a general question out to our panelists. Thank you again, panelists, for everything today. It's been great talking with you. Last question is, what's your biggest concern right now about rolling out a vaccine?
I think the answer is really easy on my end. I'm concerned about vaccine hesitancy and how people or how willing people would be to accept the vaccine once it's out there.
For me, I'm concerned that there will be vaccines, but those vaccines might not get to the people that actually need them, especially in the low and middle-income countries around the world. And that I'm also concerned that we might miss the opportunity to build systems that will be helpful for us in the future.
Yeah, for me, the challenge is balancing the need to do this fast and get something available for the world versus the rush of shortcutting the science and the transparency that is needed to help make this acceptable to everyone. And if we get that wrong, and either we delay too long, and as I said early on, we're in a war, we need help. We don't have a lot of tools in the toolbox to help today. So we desperately need some vaccines.
Yeah.
And we want to get them sooner rather than later. But if we do it too quickly and we don't have full transparency to show the safety, then I think that will create the hesitancy or the unwillingness of people around the world to say, let's take this vaccine. They may sit back longer and watch and see what happens. And if that occurs, then we're just going to continue to have the spread of disease and a lot of sickness and serious disease consequences. So I think we have a delicate balance here. And I just hope we get it right.